Elena had grown used to the quiet, a kind of stillness that wrapped around her life like a heavy quilt. Her cabin sat on the edge of the prairie, where the grasses seemed endless and the sky stretched so wide it felt like it might swallow her whole. Years had passed since she'd spoken to anyone beyond a passing trader or the occasional trapper moving west. The silence was at first a torment, a cruel reminder of the life she had once known, the laughter of her husband, the warmth of shared meals, the comfort of not being alone. But time, with its relentless march, had turned that pain into a dull ache, and the dull ache into something she called peace, though deep inside she knew it was closer to surrender. Each morning she fetched water from the well, the rope biting her hands as she pulled up the heavy bucket. She tended the little garden behind the cabin, coaxing beans and squash to grow from the stubborn soil. Her afternoons were spent splitting wood, gathering herbs, and patching clothes by the fire's dim light. Evenings brought her to the porch, where she rocked gently in her old chair, listening to the cicadas hum and the coyotes cry in the distance. Life was measured by chores and the steady rhythm of seasons, each day blending into the next, safe in its sameness. Yet safety often carried with it a hollowness she did not speak aloud, even to herself. On one such evening, when the sun bled red across the horizon and the air grew heavy with the smell of dust, Elena heard something unfamiliar. At first it was faint, like a storm gathering far away, a low rolling sound that made her straighten in her chair. She set her sewing aside and strained to listen. It grew louder, steadier, rhythmic. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized it was not thunder. The pounding of hooves reached her ears, growing nearer until the very earth beneath her feet seemed to tremble. She stepped off the porch, shading her eyes against the fading light, and then she saw them. 7 riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes cut sharp against the burning sky. Her heart thudded painfully as they drew closer, their ponies swift and sure, their long hair flowing like dark banners. When they stopped before her cabin, dust swirling around them, she recognized them for who they were: Comanche warriors, 7 strong, their faces hard from travel, their presence filling the space around her like a storm pressing in. For a long moment she could not move, the wooden pail still clutched in her hands, her breath shallow as the leader dismounted and raised a hand toward her in a gesture of peace. The leader spoke first, his voice low and measured, the words heavy with an accent but clear enough for Elena to understand. They had been traveling for many days, he explained, following the endless sweep of the prairie, hunting, moving with the wind. The autumn air carried a sharp bite now, and night would soon fall hard upon the land. They needed shelter, just for a night, a place to rest their horses and their bodies before the trail called them again. Elena felt the weight of their gazes on her, 7 pairs of eyes studying her with quiet intensity, and though her pulse thundered in her ears, she knew the ways of the frontier. To turn away weary travelers was to invite ill fortune, and more than that, it was against the very principles of survival. Her cabin was small, her stores meager, but the code of hospitality was one she could not break. With a hesitant nod, she pushed open the cabin door wider, gesturing for them to enter. The room, usually so empty and silent, seemed to shrink as they stepped inside one by one. Their presence brought with it the scent of leather, smoke, and horses, a raw vitality that filled every corner. One of them, older with gray streaking his braids, crouched by the hearth and fed the fire, coaxing it to life until its glow filled the space. Another carefully laid down his weapons, his movements slow, deliberate, as though to reassure her. Elena busied herself with what she could offer, pulling down a pot and setting it to boil with beans and strips of dried venison. Her hands trembled as she worked, but she forced herself into the rhythm of the familiar, the steady stirring of a spoon, the hiss of water against hot iron. When the food was ready, she served it in simple wooden bowls, and the men ate with quiet gratitude, their voices rising in low conversation, sometimes in words she understood, sometimes in their own tongue. Laughter broke out in soft bursts, deep and rolling, and the cabin that had for so long echoed with silence was suddenly alive with sound. Yet among them, one stood apart in a way that drew her attention. He was younger, his features strong but not yet weathered, his eyes dark and restless. While the others ate and spoke, he glanced at her often, quickly turning away when she caught his gaze. There was nothing harsh in the way he looked at her, no threat, only a quiet curiosity that unsettled her more than she expected. She tried to focus on the tasks at hand, on clearing bowls and stoking the fire, but always she felt those eyes lingering, as though he saw something in her solitude that the rest did not. The windows as night deepened, rattling the shutters and pressing against the walls of the cabin with a restless howl. Soon the storm broke, fierce and unrelenting, rain lashing against the roof like 1,000 drumbeats, thunder splitting the sky wide open. Elena sat near the fire, her needle in hand as she tried to mend a worn shirt, though her fingers trembled each time lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes. The Comanche warriors lay scattered on the floor, wrapped in blankets, their breathing steady as they sought rest, yet one of them stirred and rose quietly. It was the younger one, the one whose eyes had lingered on her through the evening. He approached the fire, and in his hand he held something small, carved and polished, a piece of bone shaped into charm. Without a word at first, he crouched beside her and offered it, his expression solemn. She hesitated, her gaze flicking from the charm to his face, then back again. Slowly, she reached out, and in that moment her fingers brushed against his, the warmth of his skin startling against the chill that crept through her own. In halting English, he spoke his Namiatu. His voice was soft, almost careful, as though afraid the storm outside might swallow his words. He told her pieces of himself in fragments, of battles fought, of brothers lost to the clash of steel and the hunger of the land, of endless journeys under sun and moon. His eyes held the depth she had not seen in years, the kind of weight that only loss could carve into a soul. She found herself answering in kind, her voice quieter than she expected, carrying her own confessions into the dim room. She spoke of her husband taken by fever, of the nights when the silence pressed so heavily on her chest she thought it might break her, of the strange endurance it took simply to go on when all reason said she should have folded long ago. To listened, truly listened, his gaze fixed on her as though each word mattered. The storm outside grew fiercer, rattling the very beams of the cabin, but the space between them grew warmer, steadier, bound by an understanding neither had sought yet somehow found. When he spoke again, it was not of war or loss but of the stars above the prairie, how they guided him on dark nights, how they never failed to appear no matter the storm. And she realized, with a faint, unsteady breath, that for the first time in years, someone was guiding her through the darkness too. Morning came quiet. After the storm, the prairie washed clean, the grass was heavy with dew that sparkled under the rising sun. Elena stepped outside as the first light spilled across the land, the scent of wet earth sharpened the air. Behind her, the warriors prepared their ponies, tightening straps and fastening gear, their voices low but purposeful. The fire inside the cabin had burned to embers, and the warmth that had filled the space the night before seemed to linger now only in her chest. She watched them with a strange ache building inside, realizing how quickly her solitude had shifted, how alive the cabin had felt in those few short hours. They were men of the road, bound to the horizon, and she knew it was not in their nature to stay. Yet the thought of them leaving, of the silence closing in again, pressed heavy on her heart. To move among his companions, helping to ready their things, but his gaze strayed often to where she stood by the porch. His movements seemed slower, reluctant, as if each knot tied and each saddle secured carried the weight of hesitation. When the others mounted, he remained on the ground, his hand resting lightly on the mane of his horse. The elder called to him, a sharp word in their tongue, but he did not answer right away. Instead, he turned and walked toward her, his steps deliberate, the morning sun catching in his dark hair. Elena's breath caught, her hands twisting in the folds of her apron as he stopped before her. In a voice softer than the wind, he asked if he could return. His English was broken, the words simple, but the meaning clear. Would she welcome him again? Should the trails bring him back to her door? She looked into his eyes, and in them she saw not just the warrior who had endured loss, but the man who had listened to her in the dark, who had shared his stories, who had given her the charm she now kept close against her skin. Her throat tightened, but she managed a small nod, the faintest of smiles tugging at her lips. The call of his companions rose again, urgent now, and he gave her one last look, steady and full of promise, before mounting his horse. As they rode away across the glittering prairie, Elena stood on the porch watching until they were no more than distant shapes against the horizon, the silence settling around her once again, yet no longer the same silence she had always known. Subscribe this channel.